There is a version of the story that Tolkien never wrote, not because he forgot it, and not because it was impossible within the world he built, but because it happened in the silence between the chapters, in the long years of anonymous wandering that the appendices describe in precise dates, and the main text barely touches. It happened in the borderland east of the Shire, where the trees grow old and strange, and the hills carry names that were already ancient when the first hobbits settled the land, where a ranger who had not yet told the world what he was might have walked, again and again, through territory ruled by a being who already knew everything that moved within it. What if I told you that for over 60 years, Aragorn patrolled the exact ground that Tom Bombadil calls his own? Not nearby, not adjacent, the same hills, the same paths, the same dark water where the forest meets the river. And Tom Bombadil, who Tolkien describes as possessing a pure desire to know all other things as themselves, who already knew the names of 4 hobbits he had never formally met, whose awareness extended across every tree and stone and creature in his domain, would have felt the presence of the last heir of Isildur walking his land again and again across 6 decades. This is not speculation pulled from nowhere. This is what the maps and the appendices actually show when you read them together. The question the fandom never asks is not whether they could have met. It is what it meant that they did. Open Appendix B of The Lord of the Rings to the section called The Tale of Years, 3rd Age 2956. The entry reads simply, Aragorn meets Gandalf the Grey. From the Tale of Aragorn and Arwen, in Appendix A, we learn what happens next. Aragorn, now 25 years old, enters his years of wandering and service, the long decades in which he disguises himself as a ranger called Strider and patrols the borders of the Shire and Bree-land, serving the free peoples of the North without recognition, without title, without the world knowing what he is. 3rd Age, 3018. The Fellowship departs Rivendell. That is 62 years. 62 years of systematic patrol along a defined border by a man who has been told since childhood that everything might depend on whether he is ready when the moment finally comes. Not wandering in the romantic sense the movies suggest. Drifting through unnamed wilderness because that is what exiled heirs do. Patrolling, with purpose, with a defined territory, with an understanding that the Shire's invisibility from the shadow is not a natural condition, but an achievement that requires constant maintenance by people who are never thanked for it. Think for a moment about what 62 years actually means. Aragorn was born in 3rd Age, 2931. He is 25 when he takes up the ranger's life. He is 87 when Frodo finds him in the corner of the Prancing Pony in Bree, and even then, even at 87, he has another 18 years before he becomes king. He has spent more years guarding the Shire than most hobbits who have ever lived spent drawing breath. He knows every farm, every crossing, every seasonal pattern of danger along those borders. He has walked those paths in the frozen quiet of midwinter and in the green rush of spring floods. He has watched multiple generations of hobbits live complete lives in the protected obscurity that his patrol makes possible. And they do not know his name. They call the rangers vagabonds. They call them roughs. Tolkien notes this in the prologue to The Fellowship of the Ring, with a patience that contains a certain sorrow. The hobbits had forgotten that the safety they enjoyed had a human cost, paid in years, and cold and darkness by men who had accepted invisibility as the condition of their service. Aragorn accepted it for 62 years. Now here is the question the maps demand you ask. Where exactly does the Shire's eastern border run? In Tolkien's cartography, the Shire's eastern boundary follows the Brandywine River. East of the Brandywine lies Buckland, the easternmost inhabited part of the Shire, occupied by the Brandybuck family and their neighbors. And east of Buckland, directly adjacent, sharing a border that the Brandybucks felt nervous enough about to build a great hedge against, lies the Old Forest, Tom Bombadil's domain. Any ranger assigned to protect the eastern flank of the Shire from what might come out of the wilderness beyond it would have patrolled the edge of that forest. Not once. Not on a few notable occasions. Every patrol that covered the eastern route would have taken him past the boundary of the old forest, past the territory that Tom Bombadil has called his own, since before the hobbits existed, since before the Dunedain existed, since before the kingdom of Arnor was built on the ruins of the Númenóreans who settled these northern lands. That is not a peripheral fact. That is the geographic foundation of everything that follows. When Frodo, Sam, Merry and Pippin tumble out of the old forest and into the dell where Tom Bombadil lives singing to himself, the first thing Tolkien establishes is not Tom's age, or his power, or the complex question of his philosophical position within the legendarium's cosmology. The first thing Tolkien establishes, quietly, as though it is simply a given, is that Tom already knows who they are. He calls Frodo by name before Frodo introduces himself. He knows about Old Man Willow. He knows the hobbits have been in danger. He knows, as he explains later in a casual aside, that Farmer Maggot sent him word about some unusual hobbits heading toward the forest. And the way Tolkien writes this scene is important, because Tom's knowledge of the hobbits does not feel like intelligence gathering. It does not feel like surveillance or monitoring, or the output of any formal system. It feels like the natural consequence of being the kind of being Tom is, the kind of being for whom awareness of everything within his domain is not an achievement, but simply a condition of existing. Goldberry, when the hobbits ask who Tom is, gives an answer that is both absolutely opaque and absolutely precise. He is, she says, not, he is the master of this forest, or he is one of the ancient powers, or he is a spirit from the earliest age. Just, he is, he exists. His existence is complete enough that further description would be reduction rather than clarification. And what Tolkien is establishing through that exchange is that Tom Bombadil's relationship to the world is not the relationship of a power who has chosen a particular place to rule. It is the relationship of a consciousness so completely at home in existence itself that the specific place is simply where that consciousness happens to be located. Now here is where Tolkien's letters open the door that the main text only leaves ajar. In letter 144, written to Naomi Mitchison in 1954, Tolkien describes Tom as exemplifying a particular mode of being characterized by what he calls pure natural science. Not natural science in the sense of laboratories and hypotheses. Natural science in the older, deeper sense of the word. The love of things as they are, the desire to know the world not in order to use it, or improve it, or submit it to any project at all, but simply because the world is there, and interesting, and real. Tom, Tolkien writes, is the spirit of a way of knowing that has almost vanished. This is the philosophical key to what his awareness means. When Tom greets the hobbits, he does not ask them to explain themselves. He already knows their situation because his awareness extends through his domain, the way light extends through a room. Everything that enters that room is illuminated. The illumination does not require effort or attention or intention. It is simply what happens when a being of Tom's nature is present. Picture this. A morning in early spring, Third Age 2962. The heir of Isildur is 31 years old, 6 years into the ranger's life, still young enough that the weight of what he carries has not yet fully settled into his face. He is walking the path along the eastern bank of the Brandywine, just south of Buckland, where the trees of the old forest crowd the river's edge and the water runs dark and cold from the hills beyond. He has been on patrol for 5 days. He is tired in the particular way of someone learning how tired this life can make you. He is also watchful, because he was trained in Rivendell, and old habits of attention do not leave a body just because the body is exhausted. Something moves among the trees to his left. He stops. His hand finds the hilt of his sword and rests there, not drawing, just resting, because whatever is moving in those trees is not hiding. It belongs there so completely that the question of stealth has never occurred to it. And then a figure steps out onto the path, short, stout, wearing a coat the color of harvest light, a hat with a long blue feather, eyes the color of the sky, in the moment before the stars come out. Tom looks at him. the way you look at something genuinely interesting. Now then, Tom says, who are you, and where are you bound, and what is the name your people gave you before you put on the one you're wearing now? That is speculation. That conversation is not in any text. But Tom's capacity to see through surfaces is established canon, and the ranger's habit of carrying a name that is not his own is also canon. What I am doing is following those two facts to where they naturally meet. Here is what every viewer who has watched the Peter Jackson films carries into the discussion of these two characters. They carry the assumption that Tom Bombadil is a harmless eccentric who was sensibly cut from the adaptation. They carry the assumption that Aragorn's long years as Strider were a kind of general wandering, romantic exile in unnamed wilderness. And they carry the unconscious sense that Tom and Aragorn exist in completely separate spheres of Middle-earth. One pastoral and whimsical, one epic and grave. The maps destroy all three of those assumptions. What every fan assumes is that the Shire and the Old Forest are neighbors in the story, but not in any strategically significant way. What the lore reveals is that the Shire's eastern flank, the most vulnerable and least naturally defended edge of the Hobbit country, runs directly against Tom's domain. The rangers who protected the Shire did not protect it from the west, or the north, or the south, and then occasionally swing past the east. They protected it from all directions, including the east, including the direction of the Old Forest, including the path that ran along Buckland's hedge, where the ancient trees leaned over the Brandywine. They call the rangers vagabonds, Tolkien tells us in the prologue. They do not know the rangers' names. But Tom Bombadil knows every name worth knowing in his territory. In the second book of the Fellowship of the Ring, at the Council of Elrond, something happens in plain sight, and the fandom consistently misses it. When the council is trying to determine what to do with the One Ring, someone proposes sending it to Tom Bombadil. The proposal is Gandalf's. He raises it briefly, as though acknowledging it must be raised before it can be set aside. And in a room containing Gandalf, Elrond, Glorfindel, and the combined wisdom of 3 ages of Middle-earth, the proposal is treated seriously enough to receive a careful answer. Glorfindel explains why it will not work. Tom would not guard the ring. He would likely forget about it or set it aside, because the ring has no power over Tom, not even the power to seem important. And then Glorfindel says the thing that matters most in everything anyone ever says about Tom Bombadil in the entire legendarium. In the end, if all else is conquered, Bombadil will fall, last as he was first. Last as he was first. Read that sentence carefully and sit with what it is actually claiming. Not among the first, or one of the earliest powers. First, in a world where the Valar existed before the world was made, and the Maiar served them from before the beginning of time, something about Tom's nature places him at a position the usual categories cannot contain. He predates all of it. He will outlast all of it, to the very end of the world. And then what? Then night will come, Glorfindel says. This is not the description of a peripheral character. This is the description of a being who brackets the entire story. Tolkien structured his world so that the oldest thing in it and the last thing remaining in it are the same thing. And that thing is Tom Bombadil, who lives east of the Shire and spends his days singing to the river. And Aragorn, for 60 years, walked past his front door. Now ask something different. At the Council of Elrond, when Glorfindel describes Tom in those terms, Aragorn is sitting in that room. He is already introduced at this point in the narrative as someone who knows the wildlands, who knows the roads of the north, who knows things the council has not yet asked him to produce. He is watchful and precise and economical in his speech. Does Aragorn react when Glorfindel describes Tom? Tolkien gives him no line during the discussion of Bombadil. He is silent. And that silence, in a character Tolkien consistently portrays as deliberate and precise, feels significant. Not because silence proves anything, but because a man who spent 60 years walking the edges of Tom's domain and never spoke of it in the councils of the great, would probably not choose the Council of Elrond as the moment to bring it up. Here is where the lore layers from different parts of the legendarium need to be drawn together. because the story of Aragorn's wandering years cannot be understood in isolation from the broader canvas, and that canvas reaches back through the Silmarillion to before the world was named. From the Silmarillion and the lore of Arnor, Aragorn is not merely the heir to the throne of Gondor. He is the heir to a lineage that stretches back through Elros to Eärendil the Mariner and the half-elven children of Luthien and Beren. He carries in his blood and his name the accumulated grief of a civilization that grew too proud and paid for it, the Númenóreans who sailed to Valinor against the ban of the Valar and were swallowed by the sea, the survivors who built Arnor and Gondor in the ruins of their ambition, and then watched those kingdoms also diminish, century by century, until what remained of the northern line was a chieftain and a handful of rangers walking cold roads in the dark. That is what Aragorn carries. Not just a throne, a 3,000-year inheritance of magnificence and failure and stubbornness and survival. Tom Bombadil was there for all of it, not watching in the way a historian watches, compiling records for later reference. Watching in the way he watches everything, with the complete and unhurried attention of a being who has nowhere else to be and nothing else he would rather be doing. He would have watched the Númenóreans arrive in the north. He would have watched the founding of Annúminas on the shores of Lake Evendim. He would have watched the kingdom of Arnor collapse into 3 smaller kingdoms, and those 3 kingdoms be unmade by the Witch King's long war out of Angmar. He would have watched the Dúnedain contract into a scattered people of rangers, their great cities reduced to ruins that hobbits now walk past without knowing what they are. And then he would have watched a young man with Númenórean blood and a Númenórean name and 3,000 years of unresolved tension in his lineage walk past the edge of the old forest for the first time, alone, wearing a name that was not his. Now hold that alongside the philosophical insight Tolkien gives us in Letter 144. Tom represents a mode of being characterized by pure natural curiosity, the desire to know other things as themselves, simply because they are other, not to use that knowledge, not to leverage it, not to gain anything from it, except the knowing itself. And then consider what that mode of being would have made of the heir of Isildur, conducting anonymous patrols through his territory for 6 decades. Tom would have found this extraordinary, not in the sense of alarming, not in the sense of politically significant, in the sense of genuinely, deeply, specifically interesting. Here is a man doing something unusual and difficult and real, carrying something enormous in a way that refuses to let it become consuming, and doing it in the dark, without audience, without recognition, for reasons that have nothing to do with how the carrying makes him look. This is the thing that Tom Bombadil finds worth attending to, not power, not strategy, not the great movements of the age. The specific, particular, irreducible quality of what a being is when it thinks nobody is watching. Picture this. Third age 2990. Aragorn is 59 years old. By the measure of the Dúnedain, who live longer than other men by the grace of their Númenórean blood, he is somewhere around middle age, though the service has shaped him in ways that go beyond age. He is sitting at the edge of a stream where the old forest meets the Brandywine's tributary, eating the last of his travel bread, watching the light change on the water. He has been on patrol for 4 days. He is considering the problem of a camp he found 3 days ago, east of the Bridgefields, that moved in a way that suggested purpose rather than wildlife, something looking for a specific other thing. He hears Tom before he sees him. Not the full song, the cascading waterfall of Tom's usual voice, but a quieter version, almost under the breath, the way someone hums when they are working through a thought, or simply because silence feels slightly wasteful when there is so much to sing about. Tom comes through the trees from the north, moving with the ease of a being for whom terrain has never been adversarial, and he stops when he sees the ranger. There is a pause. Tom looks at him, not as a threat, not as a curiosity in the usual sense, but in some third way that belongs to a being who has been watching the same man walk past his land for 34 years and has simply been waiting for the right moment to stop and actually speak. "You have been carrying something," Tom says. Not a question. Aragorn does not deny it. Men who have spent decades practicing invisibility also practice, as a necessary skill, the art of saying true things without explaining them. Yes, he says. Tom sits down on a root, fully and comfortably, as though the root was placed there for exactly this purpose. Most of what passes through these woods is carrying something. The trees carry what they remember. The river carries what it picks up in the hills. I have been watching things carry things for longer than most things that carry things have existed. A pause. Yours is different. Is it? Aragorn says. Most carried things are from the past. Yours is pointed at something that has not happened yet. Tom looks at him with those bright, impossible eyes. That is a different kind of weight. That is speculation. That conversation is not in any text. But it follows logically from what Tolkien established. Tom's mode of knowing, Tom's directness, the absence in him of any motive requiring indirection, and Aragorn's long habit of saying only what is true and nothing more. I am building the version of their meeting that the canon makes possible, not the version the canon confirms. And the question of what a man carrying a future feels when he is truly seen by something ancient enough to know what that future represents, that is worth sitting with. Here is the thing about Tom Bombadil's mode of seeing. It is not supernatural in the sense of being exceptional within his own frame of reference. It is simply what happens when awareness is not filtered through need. Tom has no stake in what he perceives. He wants nothing from any of it. He does not look at a thing and begin calculating what it can do for him, or whether it poses a threat, or how it fits into a plan. He looks at a thing and receives it, the way a pool of still water receives the image of everything above it, without distorting, without selecting, without the self-consciousness that makes most perception a negotiation between what is there and what you need to be there. Tolkien establishes this most clearly in the ring scene in Tom's Dell. When Frodo puts on the ring and disappears, Tom reaches out and takes Frodo's hand from what appears to be empty air. He was not searching. He simply knew where Frodo was. Because the ring's mechanism of concealment, which works by withdrawing the wearer from the visible world and placing them more fully in the world of shadow, did not apply to Tom. The ring-san could not make anything invisible to Tom because Tom was not looking through the system the ring manipulates. He was looking directly. And what he would have seen in Aragorn, looking directly across 60 years of encounter, is something the Council of Elrond only half understood. They saw Aragorn as the heir to a throne, the necessary claimant to a legitimacy the free peoples needed in order to win the war. They were right about that. But Tom would have seen something more personal and more interesting. He would have seen a man teaching himself, day by day and patrol by patrol, how to want something without being consumed by the wanting. How to love a world, a person, a future, without turning that love into a grip. How to be the last of a great line and carry that weight not as entitlement, but as obligation, not as a claim, but as a question. Am I the person that this requires? That is what 60 years of anonymous service is, in its deepest structure. It is not selflessness in the sense of not caring about yourself. It is selflessness in the sense of not letting the self become the center of gravity around which everything else orbits. It is the practice of caring about something more than you care about being recognized for caring about it. Tom Bombadil does this without effort. He has never had to learn it, but a man who is learning it, in the slow, difficult human way, is doing something that deserves attention. Because here is what that actually means. The most powerful being in the old forest, the being who preceded all of Middle-earth's recorded history and who Tolkien places outside every category of power and corruption, would have found Aragorn's particular journey worth watching. Not because it would affect Tom, not because Tom had any stake in the outcome, but because it was genuinely interesting, because this was a man doing something unusual and difficult and real. And Tom Bombadil's fundamental orientation toward the world is one of being interested in things that are unusual and difficult and real. There is a passage in the prologue to The Fellowship of the Ring that almost every reader skips because it is in the prologue, which is also where all the Hobbit genealogy lives, and most readers are in a hurry to get to the actual story. But the passage is precise and important. Tolkien writes that the Shire's real protection had, in the past, been carried out by rangers who were not hobbits. He says that this arrangement had been largely forgotten by the time of the story, that the hobbits no longer remembered the men who guarded them, that the men who guarded them had accepted this forgetting as a condition of their work. Think about the psychological architecture of that arrangement. The Rangers of the North, the Dunedain, protected the Shire for generations knowing they would not be remembered. The hobbits they were protecting actively looked down on them, called them roughs and vagabonds, crossed the street to avoid them in Bree. The protection was most effective when it was most invisible, when nothing ever happened that would remind the hobbits that something could happen. The success of the patrols was measured by the absence of events. This is the life Aragorn lived for 62 years. Now set that beside the other kind of invisible presence in the same landscape. Tom Bombadil, who has lived in the Old Forest since before the hobbits existed, whom the Brandybucks barely know by name and would not dream of disturbing, who maintains no formal border or guard of any kind, but whose presence in the land creates a natural limit on what darkness can do in that corner of Middle-earth, simply because of what Tom is. Two kinds of invisible protection. Two completely different relationships to what they are doing. Tom does not protect anything in the sense of having decided to protect it. He simply is what he is, and what he is cannot coexist with certain kinds of darkness. Old Man Willow bends his roots, and malice runs in the forest's old blood. But the forest has its limits, and those limits are named Bombadil. Not because Tom enforces them, because Tom defines them, the way the edge of the light defines the beginning of the shadow. Aragorn protects things in the fullest sense of having decided to, having accepted the cost, having shown up year after year in the cold and the dark. And here is where those two kinds of protection illuminate each other in a way that neither illuminates alone. Tom's protection is sustainable because it costs him nothing. He is what he is, and being what he is happens to be beneficial to the things that live around him, but it is also, in some sense, impersonal. Tom loves his land and his river and Goldberry, but he loves them in the way that a spring loves the hill it runs through. The love is not conditional on whether the hill remains grateful. Aragorn's protection is costly, because it is entirely chosen, entirely personal, entirely dependent on the willingness of a man to keep showing up. But it is also, precisely because of its cost, the most human kind of care. He is not protecting the Shire because he cannot help it. He is protecting it because he has decided that this is what the world needs, and he is the person who can provide it. What you get when you look at both of them together is a complete picture of what love for a place looks like in Tolkien's world, not one or the other, both. The ancient presence that has always been there, that the place is organized around without knowing it, and the deliberate guardian who showed up and chose to stay, who could have gone anywhere and did this, who spent 60 years being invisible so that the thing he loved could remain unaware of its own vulnerability. Tolkien made a specific choice in the tale of Aragorn and Arwen. He chose to write the story of 62 years of wandering in the form of a summary, not a narrative, not a sequence of events, a compressed account in which decades are dispatched in a handful of sentences. He went into the wild. He wandered far. In the years that followed, he was known in many different lands and among many different peoples. He made this choice in a book that contains exhaustive appendices covering the entire history of Númenor and Gondor and Rohan, genealogical tables going back to the First Age, chronological accounts of every significant event across the Third Age. He was not short of space or detail. He chose, deliberately, to leave the wandering years largely empty. Why? One possible answer is that the wandering years were private in a way the larger history was not. The appendices are history. The history belongs to the age and can be recorded. But the 60 years in which Aragorn became the person who could face the Palantir and win, who could resist the ring without effort, who could lead armies to the Black Gate and mean every word of the speech he gave there, those years belong to Aragorn in a way that history cannot contain. Another answer, which this video has been building toward. The wandering years are left empty because they contain things that the fandom has not thought to ask about. Not battles, not political developments, not events that shaped the war, but encounters, conversations, the slow accumulation of understanding that comes from walking the same land for 60 years and paying attention to everything you meet there, including an ancient being in a yellow coat who lives at the edge of the old forest and finds the whole world worth singing about. Here is the thing about Tom's silence, if he knew. Tom Bombadil, Tolkien establishes in letter 144, possesses a pure desire to know all other things as themselves. He does not possess a drive to name those things to each other. He does not feel the need to announce what he knows or share it with the person who is the subject of his knowing. He simply knows, in the way he knows the age of a root or the direction of a flood. The knowledge is its own completion. It does not require a downstream use. Which means Tom, looking at the last heir of Isildur walking his borders year after year, would have known what he was looking at and felt no compulsion whatsoever to say, "I know what you are." Do you know what you are? Because Tom does not ask that kind of question, not because he is incurious, but because Tom already knows the answer, and the answer is not in doubt. And the interesting thing is not whether Aragorn is the heir of Isildur. The interesting thing is what the heir of Isildur is doing with that fact, how he is carrying it, whether the carrying is changing him, whether the shape of what he will become is visible yet in the shape of what he is. That is what Tom would have been watching, and that is the most profound thing any being could have offered Aragorn in those years. Not information, not recognition, not wisdom in the transferable sense, just the experience of being genuinely seen by something that expected nothing from what it saw. Picture this. The last time Aragorn walks the eastern border of the Shire before everything changes. Third age 3018. He is 87 years old. He has received word from Gandalf. There are Nazgul moving north. The whole great plan is in motion, and there is no more time for patrols. He walks the familiar path one last time, the one along the Brandywine, the one where the trees of the old forest lean over the water in the early morning, and the ground is soft with dew, and the whole place feels like a held breath. He stops, just for a moment, not because he hears something or sees something out of place, but because the place deserves a moment of acknowledgement. He has spent 62 years on this ground. He is about to leave it, possibly forever, walking toward the road that will either end with him on the throne of Gondor or end in the ruin of everything. He looks east, toward the old forest, toward the dell that is not visible from the path, but that he knows is there as well as he knows his own hands. And somewhere in the trees, carried on the morning air, he can hear singing. Tom Bombadil, singing to himself the way he always is. Singing about rivers and roots, and the particular quality of the morning light, the way he sang before Aragorn was born, and the way he will sing long after Aragorn's descendants have faded from memory. The ranger stands there and listens, not for long, just long enough. And then he adjusts the cloak on his shoulders, and turns south, and walks toward Bree. Now here is what it means that those two things happened in the same world, in the same moment, on the same morning. Tom singing, and Aragorn leaving. The oldest thing in Middle-earth conducting its endless, purposeless, entirely satisfying relationship with the world, and the man who is about to risk everything he is and everything the world needs him to be, walking away from the border he has kept for 60 years, not knowing if he will come back. Those two things are not in tension. They are the same thing, seen from two different scales. Tolkien built his world with a very specific theology of power. Power corrupts in proportion to the greatness of the one who reaches for it. This is not a generalization or a moral platitude. It is a cosmological rule, as structural as the physics of the rings. The greater you are, the more the ring can offer you, and therefore, the more completely it would unmake you. Galadriel refuses it because she knows exactly what she would become. Gandalf refuses it for the same reason. Even Frodo, small as he is in the scheme of things, is nearly undone by it at the last. Aragorn never touches the ring. Not once in the entire story does he reach for it. And this is where the 60 years matter. Because the thing that makes a great person safe from power is not the absence of desire. It is the presence of a relationship to the world that is more fundamental than any desire. It is, in some form, the thing Tom Bombadil has, and that Aragorn, across 60 years of anonymous service, was slowly, imperfectly, and genuinely building. Tolkien never tells us how Aragorn got there. The text jumps from "he became Strider" to "he sat in the corner of the prancing pony, saying very little and missing nothing." The 60 years are in the silence. And the silence is deliberately left open for exactly the kind of question this video has been asking. What did Aragorn learn in those years that made him capable of facing the Palantir and winning? Of standing before the Black Gate and speaking with the kind of authority that is not performance but fact? Of placing the crown on his own head and feeling it as a responsibility rather than a prize? I do not think Tolkien intended a clean answer. I think he intended us to feel the weight of the years. But I think there is something true in the idea that the most unusual education available in that corner of Middle-earth was sitting in a dell east of Buckland, singing to the river, paying the most loving and unhurried attention in the history of the world to everything that moved through the land. And I think there is something true in the idea that a ranger who walked that land for 60 years, who had the curiosity and the depth that Aragorn demonstrably possessed, would not have passed that dell 100 times without stopping. Not because it was strategic, not because Tom had something to offer in the usual transactional sense, but because the world Tolkien built rewards exactly that kind of attention. Because in Tolkien's world, as in the older stories he was drawing from, wisdom does not come from the council chambers of the powerful, but from the unexpected encounters in the wild places. From the conversations that happen by accident, or by what looks like accident, in the years nobody is watching. What does it mean that the world Tom Bombadil inhabits and the world Aragorn is fighting to preserve are the same world? Not metaphorically the same, literally, geographically, precisely the same. The same river, the same fields east of Buckland, the same hills with the same old names. Tom loves this land in the way he loves it, which is without possessiveness and without the concept of loss, because Tom cannot really lose anything. He will be here after everything else has gone. And Aragorn loves this land in the way he loves it, which is at enormous personal cost, across 60 years of service, for something he cannot guarantee will survive. Those two kinds of love for the same place produce the fullest picture of what Tolkien thought the world was worth. He built a world in which the greatest things, the acts that saved Middle-earth, were almost all made in the dark by people who had no audience. Frodo's choice at the crack of doom was completed by Gollum falling, and nobody on Arda witnessed it except the Eye. Sam carried Frodo up the mountain, and it would not have been possible if Sam had not spent years learning the particular quality of faithfulness that service requires. Gandalf fell in Moria and returned, and nobody asked how. The pattern in Tolkien's world is that the most important things happen where nobody is watching, and that the people capable of doing them became capable in exactly those years and exactly those places where nobody was watching. Aragorn's 62 years of anonymous patrol are not the prologue to the story. They are the story, or the most important part of it. The part where the person the world needed was being made in the silence and the dark and the cold. On the roads between Bree and Buckland, in the years when the only witness was an ancient being in a yellow coat who had been watching this land since before the concept of a king existed. And Tom Bombadil, who has never wanted anything except to know the world as it is, who has no investment in outcomes or victories or the succession of kingdoms, who will be here after Gondor itself is a memory, knew what he was watching and found it worth watching. That is the version of the story Tolkien left in the silence. That is what the maps show when you follow them east of the Shire. That is what the appendices contain between the dates. And that brings us back to the question this video has been building toward from the first sentence. Heavier now than when we first asked it, because now you have the geography and the cosmological positioning and the 60 years. Did Tom Bombadil know who Aragorn was during those long years of wandering? And if he did his silence mean that knowledge was beneath his concern? Or did he understand, better than any elf or wizard, that some things can only be learned by the person who must live them? That the specific thing Aragorn needed in those years was not to be seen as the king. That to be seen as the king, by a being who sees through everything, before he had built the king in himself, would have been the wrong kind of seeing at exactly the wrong moment? And if that is true, then Tom Bombadil's silence was not indifference. It was the deepest possible form of care. Not because he chose it for that reason. Tom does not calculate. Tom does not strategize. Tom just is. But what he is includes the wisdom to know, without deciding to know it, that everything becomes what it is, in its own time, and that the most loving thing you can offer a being carrying a hard question is to sit with them, fully present, without offering the answer. The world did not forget what happened in those long years between the son of Arathorn taking up a ranger's cloak and the world's need finally coming to find him. But Tolkien left it mostly unwritten, and I think he left it that way because the most important things in his world always happen where nobody is keeping records. In small moments, in the wild places, in the space between the singing and the footsteps on the path. If you have spent any time living with these books, if you have ever followed a date in the appendices into a question the main text does not answer, if you have ever looked east of the Shire on the map and wondered what moved through it in those long years before everything changed, then you already know what I am talking about. Drop your thoughts below. Did Tom Bombadil know who Aragorn was? Did it matter to him, in the way that things matter to Tom, which is entirely and without agenda? Or is the more unsettling possibility that Tom knew, and it mattered to him the way sunlight matters, and river water matters, and the sound of a particular morning matters, simply because it was real, and it was there, and it was worth attending to? That is the question I cannot stop thinking about. If this is what you come here for, there is more where this came from. Subscribe and come back next time.